We are live.
Good afternoon and welcome to the meeting of the Exam Schools Admission Task Force. Because this is a remote session, I will ask Ms. Parvex to call the roll. Ms. Parvex, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mr. Contompasses. Mr. Acevedo,
Present.
Ms. Aguirre,
Present.
Mr. Chernow,
Present.
Mr. Kreger,
Present.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom, Ms. Lam,
Present.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Present.
Dr. Tang,
Here.
Ms. Wade, Ms. Sullivan,
Present.
and Mr. Contompasses.
Present. Thank you, Ms. Parvex. We are pleased to be offering live simultaneous interpretation in Spanish, Haitian Creole, Cape Verdean, Portuguese, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Somali, Arabic, and American Sign Language. After I finish introducing the interpreters, we will activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Click the icon to select your language preference. Our Spanish interpreter this evening is Randolph Dominguez. Would you please introduce yourself, sir?
Good evening, Mr. Contompasses and members of the board. Muy buenas noches, damas y caballeros. Mi nombre es Randolph Domínguez. Voy a ser su intérprete simultáneo en español del día de hoy. Para poder escuchar esta reunión en el idioma español, deben de buscar en la parte inferior de su pantalla un globo terráqueo. Allí van a seleccionar el idioma español y van a poder escuchar esta conversación simultánea en el idioma español. Si están utilizando un celular, por favor buscar los 3 puntos en la parte superior derecha de su pantalla y allí seleccionar el idioma español. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Our Cape Verdean interpreter this evening is Lidiana Mendez. Would you please introduce yourself?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Liliana. Alô, sim, boa tarde. Meu nome é Lidiana, de ser por intérprete de Cabo Verde Crioulo. E para nós que criamos aquela reunião ali na Cabo Verde Crioulo, na nossa tela, na de baixo, nós seleciona idioma de boa preferência. E também se você está na móvel, lá para riba, naquelas 3 linhas, você clica lá e você faz a escolha tipo idioma de preferência de língua. Obrigada.
Thank you. Our Portuguese interpreter is Ana Paula de Sá. Would you please give the Zoom instructions in Portuguese?
Good evening, everyone. Boa noite, meu nome é Ana Paula, você é sua intérprete de português. Eu quero dar as instruções que se você tiver num computador, por favor, olhe o globo na parte inferior do seu computador e selecione o português para ouvir essa tradução simultânea em português. Se você estiver usando um celular, tem os 3 pontos logo em cima, escolha português e assim você vai participar da reunião escutando no seu idioma de preferência. Muito obrigada.
Thank you. Our Vietnamese interpreter is V Phong Lee. Please give the Zoom instructions in Vietnamese.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is V Phong Lee. I will be your Vietnamese interpreter for today. Kính chào quý vị, tôi tên là Vi, tôi sẽ là thông dịch viên của quý vị vào ngày hôm nay. Để có được cuộc họp và nghe được những gì thông dịch viên nói, xin quý vị nhìn vào dưới màn hình và bấm tìm kiếm quả cầu và bấm vào đó và tìm tiếng Việt ngôn ngữ của mình để có thể nghe được thông dịch viên nói chuyện. Nhưng mà để có được cái phần này thì quý vị phải có cái phần mềm của Zoom mới nhất để có thể nghe được những gì tôi nói. Cảm ơn rất nhiều. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Cantonese interpreter is Anna Se. Please give the Zoom instruction.
Thank you. 大家星期二下午好，我係 Anna， 我係你嘅廣東話同步翻譯員。而一陣間見到個地球儀咧，揀 Chinese 撳落去，咁你就會聽到廣東話同步翻譯噶啦。如果你用手機或者用 iPad 嘅話，咁你就用撳嗰喺你手機度做3個點，然之後撳落去，仲有即係更多。咁之後你撳落去嘅時候咧，亦都揀 Chinese 就會去到廣東話同步翻譯噶啦。Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our Mandarin interpreter is Terry In. Please give the Zoom instructions in Mandarin.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Terry. I'll be your Mandarin interpreter. 大家好，我叫 Terry， 我是你们的普通话翻译。待会儿呢，你们就在屏幕下方可以看到有一个地球的图标，你们点击地球的图标，选择Mandarin 就可以听到普通话的翻译了。如果你是用手机或者 iPad 上的话呢，你可以选择3个点，再点这个翻译，然后你也可以进入到 Mandarin， 就是普通话的翻译。待会儿见，谢谢 ，Thank you.
Thank you. Our Haitian Creole interpreter is Sergio Saint Hilaire. Please give the Zoom instructions.
Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Sergio Saint-Hilaire, Haitian Creole interpreter. C'est un plaisir pour nous après-midi pour nous entrer dans la conversation encore et pour nous traduire pour et que nous avons fait tout possible pour nous traduire tout ça qui vient capter dans ça. Et nous demandons si vous besoin d'entrer dans la conversation, un globe qui est en bas de l'écran là, ou à cliquer et puis vous êtes capable d'entrer. Et c'est un plaisir pour nous faire tout ça nous connaît, pour nous participer avec vous et pas hésiter pour entrer dans la conversation et nous disons merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Our Arabic interpreter is Ahmed Al-Rubai.
Hello everyone, my name is Ahmed Al-Rubai. I'm your Arabic interpreter today. مرحبا، أنا اسمي أحمد الربيعي، أنا مترجم اللغة العربية لهذا اليوم. بإمكانكم الاستماع إلى الترجمة باللغة العربية بالذهاب إلى أسفل الشاشة. ستشاهدون علامة الكرة الأرضية. اضغط على هذه العلامة ستظهر لك الاختيارات بالنسبة للغات. اضغط على اختيار اللغة العربية وستتمكن عندها من الاستماع إلى الترجمة باللغة العربية. شكرا جزيلا. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Our Somali interpreter is Camilla Fartoun Jamal. Please give the instructions in Somali.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Camilla. I'm going to be interpreter for Somali today. Magacayga waa Fartoun Camilla. And galab wanaagsan qof walba meesha ku jiro waxa idinku soo dhaweynaya halkan. And galabta waxaan ka hadlaynaa shirkii hore aan qabanay afartii. Marka qolka waxay iga helaysaan Soomaalida ku soo dhawaada. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have American Sign Language interpreters, Erin Foley and Celia Michel. Thank you all for assisting. We will now activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. And I'd like to remind everyone to speak at a slower pace this evening to assist our interpreters. We will now move on to the approval of the minutes from the May 7th, 2021 remote meeting. At this time, I would like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes as presented. May I have a motion, please?
Mr. Contempasis, this is Ms. Sullivan. I move to approve the minutes with any necessary corrections.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I second.
Thank you. Ms. Parvex, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Acevedo.
Mr. Contempasis, you have a hand raised.
Oh, okay, Dr. Tung, I'm sorry, didn't see you.
Hi, I'm not sure when I'm supposed to point out things that I thought were missing from the minutes.
So this is discussion, so this would be the appropriate time.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank, I am assuming it's Ms. Parvex for taking such great minutes each meeting. And I know it's impossible to capture such long conversations, but I thought there were 2 points that are sort of relevant to our discussion going forward that I would like captured in the minutes. The first one was early on in the meeting. There was a question about efforts to mitigate test prep. And the minutes capture part of Chris Minich's answer, which was about intellectual property. But I would also like for the minutes to capture the fact that he said you cannot game the test and that they go after test prep companies. And then the second point that I'd like the minutes to capture is much later in the meeting, he and I had a several-minute exchange about evidence of predictive validity for the NWEA map growth. And I think that the fact that those studies do not exist. He doesn't know about any of studies like that, nor do they plan on doing any, is also relevant to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Parvex, have you been able to pick all of that up?
Yes, I was able to get it.
Thank you. Okay, any other additions, corrections? All right, Ms. Parvex, will you please call the roll for the minutes as amended?
Yes. Mr. Acevedo,
Aye, as amended.
Ms. Aguirre,
Yes, as amended.
Mr. Chernow,
Yes, as amended.
Mr. Kreger,
Yes, as amended.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom, not sure. Ms. Lam,
Yes, as amended.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Yes, as amended.
Dr. Tang,
Yes, as amended.
Ms. Waite,
Yes, as amended.
Ms. Sullivan,
Yes, as amended.
and Mr. Contempasis.
Yes, as amended.
Thank you.
Thank you all. We now will move on to the review of additional information and data for the exam school admissions process. I would ask, before we do that, Ms. Sullivan, if you will please handle this portion of the meeting, because I have difficulty with my iPad identifying the correct order for people to ask questions.
No
I
problem.
believe, thank you. And I believe Ms. Hogan is ready to present.
Good evening, everyone. Just pull up. Okay. So this evening, the number of items and questions that were raised around possible admissions criteria that we were able to follow up on and wanted to provide some additional information for. Go through a little bit about the difference between census tracts and geocodes, a little more detail on the Opportunity Index. There was a question about the top percentage of students by school, the percentage of economically disadvantaged students by school, a little detail on what the Chicago model could look like in Boston. There's supposed to be an image here. That isn't, I'm just gonna try and reload real quick. See if that fixes, there we go.
And Ms. Hogan, as you're pulling that up, could you also, in your presentation at some point, share with us when the task force will receive the data with respect to the admissions offers?
Yep.
Thank you.
So census tracts and geocodes. This map displays outlines of census tracts in the city of Boston. Census tracts are created by the census and approximately 178 census tracts. These are reviewed every 10 years as part of the census process. The data that is available to us by census tract
includes all of the data that is part of the American Community Survey. And so that is an annual sampling survey that's done. And they provide that data with both 1 year and 5 year averages by census tract. So it includes things like median household income, percentage of families with a single parent, multiple children, et cetera, educational attainment, so percentage of adults with a bachelor's degree, percentage of adults with a high school diploma, a lot of different data, which we'll actually look at some of a little bit later in the presentation. The question came up quite a few times around geocodes and the difference between geocodes and census tracts. So this is a map of historic geocodes in the city of Boston. I know the gray with the white lines is a little hard to see, but you'll notice that the squares are all much smaller than they were on the last slide. That's because there's over 800 geocodes in the city. We believe they were originally created in the 70s, but there's some lack of clarity on if or how or when boundaries of geocodes are redrawn, whereas for census tracts, they are revisited every 10 years. And then important to note, those American Community Survey data points that I mentioned are not available at the geocode level. So just wanted to share those two sort of distinctions between census tracts and geocodes. Ms. Sullivan, I don't know if you would like me to pause for questions because there are a couple of topics. Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, sure. I think that would be great. Okay. So I'm going to pause here then if there are any questions before I go on to sort of the next topic. So Ms. Hogan, I do not see any hands raised. However, I have a clarifying question. So in your research, so you said that you found that the geocodes were originally created in the 70s. And the third bullet point saying that, there's not clarity around if, how, or when geocodes are redrawn. Have the geocode, do we know, have the geocodes been redrawn since the 70s at all? Not to my understanding. We're continuing to ask to try and get a more definitive answer on that, but everyone that we've talked to, both within BPS and our contacts at the Boston Planning and Development Agency, did not have an immediate answer on that. So that's very helpful. If the team could also ask the office of, I forget which Sheila Dillon's office is officially called, but housing, I think within the city. Yep. About this, that'd be super helpful, because what immediately comes to mind for me is redlining and how redlining may be impacted by the geocodes, or how the geocodes may be impacted by redlining. Yep. Thank you. You'll see, okay, perfect. Now I see hands. Okay. Ms. Tung, Dr. Tung.
I'm just curious how geocodes are used currently. What are they used for?
I actually am not sure that they're used for much at this point. We have used geocodes within the Opportunity Index, to measure the number of times a student has moved in the last 5 years. Because geocodes are so small, we can see movement sort of like within census tracts or within zip codes in a way that if a student moves within a single zip code, you won't see that change. But beyond that, I am not aware of any major uses of geocodes. Thank you. I see Ms. Lum.
Yes, I was just wondering if this data, whether geocodes or maybe more likely census tract data, is used to determine whether or not a school qualifies or a district qualifies for free lunch. Is that part of the equation?
So before, I believe it was 2014, districts in Massachusetts used to collect free and reduced price lunch forms from individual families to determine if they qualified for the free or reduced price lunch program. Since I believe it's 2014, Boston has participated in what's called the community eligibility provision, which means all of our students receive free lunch regardless. And so in the 14-15 school year, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts transitioned to using economically disadvantaged as a metric in place of free and reduced price lunch, which is determined based off of student enrollment, what they call direct certification for participation in a state aid program like Mass Health, the SNAP program, other assistance to families. So the geocodes and census tracts have no bearing on that. Mr. Krager.
Thank you. Monica, this may be in your slide, but 2 follow-up questions. For the census tracts, how many are there in the city, and what is the most recent year of collection that we have available to us?
So I pulled this slide. This map is from 2010, but there should be a 2020 census tract map with the most recent census. It's approximately, I said approximately 178 because I'm not sure if the number has changed from year to year. So
got it. Okay.
More than zip codes, which were about 30, less than geocodes, which are over 800.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, so this is from, I'm sorry, Ms. Hogan, this is from 2010? This map is from 2010, yes. Okay. When will we have the 2020 update? Do you know? Since the 2020 census data has not been released yet. I believe we should have a map. This is what I had available at the time, and we can pull up, we can get a 2020 map to see how much they've changed. Okay, so the 2020 census tract data hasn't been updated. The data itself, I don't believe has been released yet. So okay, I can find out when they anticipate the 2020 census data becoming available. For reference, the American Community Survey data, which is annual and is a sampling, the 2019 American Community Survey data was released, I believe it was in January of 2021. So it is a bit of a delay. Yeah, but yes, yes, I understand that. Just trying to get a sense of whether it'll be within our timeline or not. Yep. Thank you. Mr. Acevedo. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Kreger, your hand is still raised. Are you?
I'm sorry, lowering it now. Thank you both.
Yeah, Mr. Acevedo.
Yes, Monica, this is actually sort of flip side of was the follow-up to one question with respect to the use of the Geocodes, and the flip side of that same question that Dr. Tong had asked. So first of all, I thought, as part of the Opportunity Achievement Gap Task Force, somehow I thought that the use of Geocodes in determining a school's, they played a bigger role in determining a school's opportunity index, perhaps even defining, levels of economic disability in the immediate areas or among the students serving. Well, that sounds like what you've said, right?
So the Opportunity Index, and that's actually the next section of the presentation, I believe. It's based off of Census Tract data. So it uses data from the American Community Survey by Census Tract.
And that was my next question. So I was aware of the use of Geocodes for the Opportunity Agenda or the Opportunity Index, I beg your pardon. And apart from then their use with the Opportunity Index, how else does the district use Census Tract data now?
How else do we use Census Tract data? The main application that I'm aware of is through the Opportunity Index.
Thank you.
I don't see any other hands raised. So I believe we can move to the next section. Thank you, Ms. Hogan.
Great. There will be many opportunities for questions. So a little deeper in the Opportunity Index, because on Friday, I believe I sort of just verbally said this, so wanted to provide some of it written down for more reference. But there are three main components of an Opportunity Index score. There's neighborhood components, individual student characteristics, and past performance at the student level that are aggregated together. We call it a weighted composite, where the weights are determined based off of statistical modeling of historical data. So every school gets an Opportunity Index score that's between 0.01 and 0.99. So within the neighborhood data, we look at academic attainment. So that's the percentage of adults with a bachelor's degree or higher within the census tract. We look at a safety component, which uses 911 data to be constructed by the Boston Area Research Initiative. We use a metric called physical disorder, which I believe uses 311 data from the city. And then median household income and the percentage of foreign-born adults within the census tract. And those are both from the American Community Survey. On the individual characteristics, we look at economically disadvantaged status, that residential mobility number that I referenced that uses geocode information, whether or not the student lives in public housing, and if the student is considered to be a recent immigrant, which is defined by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education as within the last 3 years. And then for past performance, this is only used for students in grades 6 through 12. We look at attendance rate and number of suspensions, and then ELA and math course failures, and ELA and math MCAS failures. And then at the bottom in this table, you'll see a distribution of the most recent OI scores. So the most recent scores that we calculated ranged from 0.17 to 0.89. 5 schools had a score less than 0.25. Over half of schools had a score that was higher than 0.51. I think those are my OI score slides. I think the other thing to note is that because of the individual nature of the data included in the OI, it's not something we're able to calculate for non-BPS schools. So it's a measure that we would be able to provide for our BPS schools only. I'll pause for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hogan. Mr. Acevedo.
Ms. Hogan, if you could just remind me, actually, this would be very helpful for OAGTF purposes as well. What is, for lack of a better term, the cutoff score or was last year for schools to access partnership fund money from BPS as a range between 0.17 and 0.89? Offhand, do you know the lowest score, at least last year, because it changes from year to year?
Yeah, the cutoff most recently was 0.565. And for those who may not be as familiar as Mr. Acevedo, the Opportunity Index is used to distribute what we call the partnership fund. So it's several $million that are distributed to schools to spend specifically on partnerships with community organizations to support their students.
How many schools do you know offhand, Monica, were within the cutoff, were within the partnership fund range? You need not identify them, just a number. How many were within that?
I don't know. Well, I can tell you based on the table on the slide, it is not more than 76. But I am not sure exactly off the top of my head.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Ms. Aguirre.
Yeah, I have a question. When we are talking about the neighborhood components of the Opportunity Index, are we referring to the neighborhood where the school is located or the neighborhood where the students attending the school live?
So
really
good question. It is based on the neighborhood where the student lives. So not where the school is located,
okay,
but where the student lives. And so it's the census tract of that student's address.
Okay, so for each school is going to be a mix of completely different scores, depending where the student lives. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Cantopasis.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Ms. Hogan, you mentioned that the weights that are attributed to the calculation of the OI scores are modified on a yearly basis. Who does that?
So we don't modify the weights on a yearly basis. We set the weights initially with the Boston Area Research Initiative. They did a validation of the Opportunity Index model and helped us develop it. And then following our first year of implementation, we did review the model based off of feedback that we heard from the community and from schools, and made a few adjustments to data that's included. So one example, the median household income variable used to be a composite of multiple variables from the American Community Survey. And in the revisions, we changed it to just median household income as one example. And so through that process, we did another round of statistical modeling to determine weights. But then we have not adjusted the weights since then.
So
that was 2 years ago.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I can frame this properly. Who then reviews the the criteria in each of these components? And is it not done yearly?
In terms of thinking
Well,
about
the data might change.
Mhm.
And so are we using the same data that was originally determined for each of these components?
So we use the 5-year average for all of the neighborhood data. And part of the idea of using the 5-year average is that it will be highly correlated from year to year. So we won't expect major shifts. Because what we don't want is for a school to move drastically in and out of the partnership fund, where they might not be able to sustain a partnership year over year. So the components of the model don't change, but we do update the data every year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garrett.
Thank you. I was just wondering which components specifically in the Opportunity Index criteria would be easily attainable, whether through public records or DESI reports or something else for non-BPS schools, that if we were trying to assess levels of need across the city, regardless of the types of schools that students attend, knowing that economically disadvantaged students attend multiple school types in the city, what would be available to us on this menu?
That's a good question and gets into a future section of the presentation. So one of the challenges is because we use the individual student's address to look at which census tract they live in for the neighborhood data. We would need to know every individual student's address to get that information for a school. That said, all of the neighborhood data is publicly available by census tract. So it's a question of determining where the students at that school live. The other items are all very individually student-based. So you need to know specifics about each individual student. So I think the neighborhood pieces maybe more generally, where you could think about, this looks at the census tract that the student lives in, but we could think about the census tract where the school is located, excuse me, as a potential for some of the neighborhood data. But there's a section that will answer some of your question, Ms. Garrett, too.
Thank you, Ms. Lum.
I have a back to basics question, which is, we know what this data is used for, but how is it used in the sense of, like, what does a low OI score mean? What does a high OI score mean? How does that factor into how much money or whether or not a school even qualifies for partnership funding?
So the OI was designed to show need relative relative to other schools in the district. And so the OI score represents that on average, a student at that school has a higher or lower level of need compared to their peers. Because essentially what happens, these items are all put together in the composite index calculation. And then we take a percentile across the district and then average those percentiles together for each school to get the school OI scores. So it's primarily designed for resource allocation within the district. So sort of to Ms. Scarrett's question, where you could have all schools in the district have 100% economically disadvantaged students, we're never going to have all schools in the district have a 0.89 OI score because the OI scores are relative to each other. That makes sense.
Ms. Hogan, could you just for clarification, does a lower OI score indicate higher need or lesser need?
Lesser need.
Great, thank you.
Wait, sorry. A lower OI score indicates lesser need, I believe is what you just said.
Yes, that is. I'm just picking up on Ms. Lum's question. So as we're looking at the first OI score range, less than 0.25, there are 5 schools in that category. Does that indicate that those 5 schools have fewer students who are high need from an economic standpoint?
On average, their students have a lower level of need compared to their peers in the district.
Okay.
As measured by these items on the slide.
Great, thank you. Ms. Aguirre.
Yes, I would like to know, I don't know if you have all that in mind, but how the weight is calculated, like each bucket, like neighborhood or individual, has the same weight, and then individual components inside each one have different weights, or different buckets have different weights, or how are the weights done?
So each component has a different weight, and they are based off of a multi-level model that was run by the Boston Area Research Initiative to determine sort of the predictive power of the component when thinking about predicting student performance.
And could you kind of let us know like which component has the higher weight?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but I can certainly share that resource.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lum.
Are we able to get a sense of which students going into exam schools from what schools they are coming from, and by virtue of that find out how many of the less than 0.25 schools are feeding into the exam schools, how many of the 0.25 to 0.50 OI schools are feeding into the exam schools?
So you're asking, I think, in terms of sending school to exam schools, what are the OI scores of those schools?
Right, and just if there seems to be a cluster or a trend. Okay.
Great question, Ms. Lum.
For clarification, I appreciate the question as well. I just want to make sure that I'm looping back to something I thought I heard you say earlier, Ms. Hogan. The OIs, we would be able to get the OI scores for sending schools that are within the BPS.
Correct.
So any sending school outside of the BPS we would not be able to, or are you able to calculate that?
We do not have that information for non-BPS schools.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Tone.
And could we have that analysis for both the year before the temporary year and then the temporary plan outcomes?
I'm sorry, Ms. Hogan, just for the interpreters and those signing, could you repeat your response?
Yes. So the OI scores for sending schools to exam schools for both this most recent admissions process and the year before. Yes.
With besides the OI score listed, can you also list the number of seats each year that they were filling?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, I think that I do not see any other hands raised, so I believe we're ready. Okay, great. Thank you.
So our next item that came up on Friday was around what could it look like if we looked at a top percentage of students from each sending school. This is similar to the model used in the state of Texas, where the top 10% of graduating seniors are guaranteed admission to a public university in the state. So we were able to look at this across all school types in Boston. And so what this slide shows is for schools with either 6th or 8th grade, how many schools there are, and using data from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. We can see both for BPS and charter schools, as well as private parochial schools, the number of schools serving each grade level, and the total number of students that they're serving based off of the most recent year of data available. The table at the bottom down here shows if you were to invite the top 5% from each of these schools, how many students would that be? Or the top 10%? Those are example percentages. They could be something different, but did want to note that because of the differing school size across the city of Boston, we have some pretty small schools and some much larger schools. You'll notice that the number is slightly higher, so 526 down here, which is the 10% of 6th grade, is slightly higher than you would expect 10% of 5,181 to be, just because of school size differences.
I'm sorry, can you explain that? How does that math work?
Because some schools are, depending on the size of the school, the percentage of that school size now that I'm explaining it, it doesn't quite make sense in my head with the math, but I can go back and verify that on the spreadsheet.
Thank you. Thank you. But generally speaking, it looks like for at the, what grade level is this? 6th grade level, the 10%, generally speaking, I know you're going to confirm this. I mean, if we're just looking simply at the numbers that are in the top chart, 10% of the total would be 518. And it looks right. And so then 5% would be about 200. That number is actually about right. 258, 259-ish. How many seats? I know you answered this question last week. And I just want to, I'm looking through my notes, but you might know it off the top of your head. How many seats were allocated in the 20% distribution this year?
In the 20, there were 974 seventh grade invitations.
974. Okay.
I believe is 195 in the 20%.
Yeah, yeah, about yeah. Okay. Super helpful. And I see, thank you. And I see Mr. Acevedo.
Right at the risk of asking a painfully obvious question, or Ms. Lum will put it back to the basics question. Again, we determine top 5% and top 10%. Is that is a student in that percentage solely on the basis of their grade point average, or does their or does any sort of score come into play?
Can I just ask a clarifying question, Mr. Acevedo? Are you asking about in the interim policy?
No, I'm talking about this particular slide. My question is limited to this slide. So we're saying that, you know, say that you're the top 10% at name a school, the Burke. Is that based on your grade point average, or is some sort of well, MCAS scores wouldn't be at play this year, but traditionally, is it primarily a matter of GPA?
Typically, class rank is done based off of GPA only.
Thank you.
Mr. Kreger.
Thank you. Monica, I'm wondering if the discrepancy in the numbers is a result of having some 6th or 8th grade classes that are smaller than 10 as a size. And because you'd have like one student be part of that top 10% selected, there could be other students who are then a number enough of those would necessitate having more seats than a perfect 518 to mirror the numbers in 6th grade, for example.
Rounding is most likely at play here.
Yeah, okay.
I'm sorry, Ms. Hogan, could you please, I couldn't understand. There was something in the background.
Yeah, I said rounding is most likely at play. So if 10%, 10% of 3,196 would be 319.6. So if you're to round that up to a full person, it would be 320. I think is the point Mr. Kreger was trying to make. And that might account for the discrepancy in the numbers.
Mr. Acevedo, is your hand still raised or is it a lingering?
It's lingering. I'll put it down. Thank you so much.
Mr. Chernow.
Hi. So my question is regarding the numbers shown in the 5 to 10. Well, it's a two-part question. So the first part is, are the numbers regarding the 5 and 10%, are they strictly for BPS students? And are we able to find data about other schools based on the 5 to 10 percentile rules in the BPS like function, like, or would we be able to access that data as well?
So the table at the bottom includes all school types. And then I think the second part of your question is how easily we would be able to know if a student is in the top 5 or 10% at their school, if it's not a BPS school. I think we don't currently have that information. And so if this is something of interest to pursue, we would need to talk with our partners in other schools in Boston around how to identify those students. And those would become implementation questions if this is of interest to pursue as a policy decision.
Thank you. I do not see any other hands raised. Great. I think I have 2 more topics. So the next slide is around the percentage of economically disadvantaged students by school. So this data is again from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Their school and district profiles. They do not publish this data for private parochial schools. So it only includes BPS schools or charter schools. But you can see from this table that the majority of schools serving either 6th or 8th grade have more than 50% of their students being economically disadvantaged. We would need to further investigate if we were able to get this information for private and parochial schools or not, since it is not publicly available on the website. Ms. Hogan, could you walk through just in a little bit more detail what this chart shows us?
Yep. So of schools serving 6th grade in the city of Boston, only one has less than 25% of their students identified as economically disadvantaged. 11 is 25 to 50%, and so on.
Great. I do not see any hands raised on Mr. Condompasis.
Thank you. Monica, the data from the 6th grade, this is mostly, can you determine or disaggregate the current K through 8s vis-a-vis the 6 through 8s?
In terms of the schools in this table?
Yeah.
Which, yes, we would know. I don't know off the top of my head how many are K-8s or 6-8s, but we have that information.
In other words, if many of these students are in one of Boston's middle schools, they may have come from a school which was not as disadvantaged. Would they not? Could that be a possibility?
I think it could be possible where they potentially attended a K-5 school that had a lower percentage of economically disadvantaged students and are now enrolled at a middle school for 6 to 8 that has a higher percentage, I think is your question.
Yes.
I think that's possible.
Thank you.
Ms. Lum?
Thank you. So as a layperson, I'm trying to understand what DESE actually tracks in terms of school age student in the state of Massachusetts. So while I understand private and parochial school data may not be publicly available, does DESE capture the same data across all school types in order to track performance of school age children in the state of Massachusetts?
That is a good question. I'm not as familiar with the reporting requirements for our private schools. So I don't want to speak incorrectly, but I do not think they capture the level of detail that they require of our public schools. But I can see what information I can find to be more concrete for you.
And similarly, if academic performance is one of the factors that DESE tracks across all school age children in the state of Massachusetts, do they have some sort of formula that levels the grading discrepancies across schools, both within a district as well as between types of schools? And if so, are they able to perhaps share that model with us as we think about how we might compare grades and academic achievement across our city?
We can certainly ask our contacts and see what is available. We'll say the primary way that DESE holds public schools accountable is through MCAS scores, which our private schools do not take. So
I believe everyone who had a hand raised has asked their question, so no more hands.
Great. This is my last section. It's a little longer and it's a little more technical. So we looked at the Chicago model of using American Community Survey data with Census Tracts. And we looked at what would that look like in the city of Boston. So at the time that this analysis was done, the most recent data available was from 2018. The 2019 data is now available. We just have not yet updated this analysis. But so the variables included are median household income, percent of households occupied by the owner, percent of families headed by a single parent, percent of households where a language other than English is spoken, and educational attainment, which combines 5 data points of adults based on their educational attainment of high school diploma, college degree, advanced degree. So this data is obtained by census tract, and each variable is then ranked and to assign a percentile to each census tract. Those percentiles are then added together to give each census tract what we're calling a socioeconomic score. And then based off of the numbers of school-age children within each census tract, census tracts are then given a tier number in order to have each tier have a roughly equal percentage of students in the tier. So should be roughly 25% in tier 1, 25% in tier 2, 25% in tier 3, 25% in tier 4. Tier 1 here would indicate census tracts with the lowest socioeconomic score. There is a note on the bottom of the slide that Chicago also later added what they call a school performance metric. For simplicity's sake, we did not include that in this replication, but I have a note on that in a later slide that we can talk a little bit about. So what this slide shows you is for census tracts in the city of Boston, what tier would they be in this methodology with the 2018 data? So the darker orange color is the highest need in this system, down to the dark blue, which would be the lowest need. There's been a lot of comments around public housing and what that looks like within a zip code. So I want to call out, in particular, you can see here in South Boston, there is public housing. This is the census tract that surrounds the Condon School, which you see is the darker orange color. And this is the census tract surrounding the Perkins School, where there is also public housing, which is the lighter orange, but the larger South Boston zip code is that darker blue. So the census tract data does give us more differentiation within a zip code to see different levels of socioeconomics. I think I'm going to pause here because I know that was a lot. Just see if there's any questions.
Are there any questions on this portion? Dr. Tung.
Monica, what's the number for tier 3?
Oh, I believe it's like 50. I missed finishing updating the slide, so I will add that in before it is sent out.
And can you remind us what's the relationship between a geocode and a census tract?
So the geocodes are much smaller. They are not necessarily, because like we talked about, lack of clarity around if geocodes have been withdrawn or, sorry, redrawn. There's not necessarily like this many geocodes within the census tract. But they are much smaller blocks than these are.
So would it be too much to ask or reasonable to ask to put, to superimpose dots for BPS schools that have, and charter schools, I guess, that have grades 6 and 8?
The location of the schools?
Yeah, I'm just, because we're talking about so many different variables. We're talking about schools and census tracts, and we're talking about opportunity indexes, which apply to schools.
Yep.
Whereas students would be assigned to tiers. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I was just thinking if we could see where the schools in the district are, that might give us other ways to think about this.
I don't see any other hands raised at this time. Miss Lum.
Sorry, thank you. I don't know if this is the same question, perhaps, or a version of the question that Ms. Tung just asked or was driving at, but we recently, a few slides ago, talked about the top percentage of students from schools, all schools. Is it possible, and this may have to happen maybe at the application stage, when we have student address information, would we be able to look at then the top percentage by ranking of applicants by tier or by tract? Does that make sense?
You mean instead of by feeder school?
Right. And it would get us information that may not be available to us until we actually have applications in hand. So it wouldn't matter whether they were coming from a private school or public school, but we would have address data, which would get us, I think, tract data, right? Or would...
Yeah, because part of the application process is the proof of residency. And so at that point, we know where a student lives, and therefore which census tract they live in. So if I'm understanding your question, I think that's essentially in the Chicago model, the first 30% of invitations are citywide. And then the remaining 70%, do the math off the top of my head, half of 35 is 17 and a half.
Yes. Yes.
So 17.5% of the remaining of invitations are allocated to each tier. And it's the top ranking students within that tier that get those invitations. So I think that's sort of what you were talking towards. Yeah.
I think so, yes.
Mr. Contemplasis.
I think this is a follow-up, but within each tier, if, for example, you look at tier 1, that includes both public as well as independent private schools, parochial schools. So it is possible within that tier 1 that a student may be coming from a non-BPS school, correct?
Right, because these tiers are based solely on the student address.
Okay.
So the tier would not be connected to the sending school's address. It would be connected to where the student lives.
Ms. Hogan, I am trying to, I'm recalling the Chicago plan. One of the things that they were primarily interested in was socioeconomic diversity. For our city, based on the data, the historical data that we have historically had a lack of diversity with respect to both socioeconomic status and geography. And so I understand how this could be helpful to us with respect to socioeconomic diversity. Do you have any thinking around how this might be helpful in advancing geographic diversity? The reason I ask the question is because my understanding is that the tiers do not track by geography. They track only by socioeconomic status.
Yeah, I think so because the tiers are based off of these indicators, household income, households occupied by the owner, they are driven more by socioeconomics of the census tract in the aggregate. But sort of what we see with this map, right, is groupings of the tiers in different areas of the city. So I think it,
Yeah. Okay, so I guess the question stated differently would be, and I'm trying to, it's hard to see all of the different neighborhoods on the map, but for example, is there anything in this tiering system that could mitigate against, in the most extreme example, all of the tier 4 invitations coming from Jamaica Plain? And that's just the only neighborhood I can cipher on the map right now.
I understand the question though, and I think because of the size of the tiers, because in this example we have 4, they won't ever be concentrated, I don't think, all in one neighborhood at any tier level. But this is an interesting question that I'd want to think about a little bit more as we continue to look at this data. So.
Great, thank you. Dr. Tung?
I think I'm a little confused. When you said that the first 30% in Chicago are citywide, and then the remaining 70% gets divided equally 4 ways, does that mean that that each tier has the same number of school-age children?
So the way the tiers are divided, it uses the number of school-age children in the census tract, and then determines the number of tracts within each tier in order to get to a roughly equal number of school-age children within each tier. So when I finish updating this slide that I clearly got partially through because I missed filling in the number of tracts here, there are more school-aged children in some of the tracts that are in tier 1 than there are in tracts that are tier 4, which is why you see more census tracts in tier 4 than you do in tier 1. Does that make sense?
Well, I just want to make sure if we were to use tiers in our policy, that the seats would be allocated proportionately to the number of kids in each tier.
Yep, that's the seats would be allocated to each tier proportionately. I think theoretically, yes. I think there then becomes a question of, are applicants distributed across each tier equally as well?
I think we just went in a circle.
So this is actually, this is a very good question. And so I do think, right, because this isn't, we want to make sure that there's equity in any process that we recommend from the standpoint of making sure, and this gets to Dr. Tung's point about the proportionate allocation of seats, which is different than an equal percentage, or could be different than an equal percentage of seats within a particular tier. So this is one that perhaps we should also, you know, kind of leave on the list to come back to after we've had some time to, folks have had some time to think about it. And then we can, you know, come back together and folks can share their thinking. Would that be helpful?
And I want to add to Ms. Sullivan's point that this has been purely a replication of the data points selected in Chicago as well, and sort of following their methodology that may or may not be the choices that this body wants to make, but wanted to use this as a illustrative starting point of options.
Thank you so much. Ms. Lum?
The other factor, and I don't know how this plays out, but applicants to exam schools are of a certain age. So even if you have equal proportions of school age children within each track, that doesn't necessarily reflect the fact that you have equal proportions of exam age qualified students in each track, correct?
Yeah, because one neighborhood might be weighted more to younger children, one might have more older children. That's certainly a factor to consider.
And on top of that, not all eligible school age children may necessarily be applicants unless we want to consider a similar possibility to the temporary policy where regardless of whether you want to apply or not, or we're thinking of applying or not, you are qualified, so that we have a qualification strata in addition to an application mechanism.
Yes.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands raised. Does anyone have any additional questions? Dr. Tung?
Not about the tier topic. I don't know if are you finishing your total presentation or?
I do have like 2 more slides, I think, on tiers that maybe I'll go through real quick, if that makes sense, or.
Sure, let me just, Mr. Chernow, I saw your hand raised. you want to ask your question now, or do you want to hold it along with Dr. Tongues?
I just had a quick clarified question. Does each tier, does each outline tier on the map have the same number of people in it, or how is that? Is that what that is?
So the outline, so like this shape here, not even sure what to call it in terms of what shape it is, but that's the outline of the census tract determined by the US Census process. I don't know offhand exactly what size of number of people they're looking for when they draw these census tract lines, but we can definitely look for more information on that.
So is that from the geocodes that you showed us earlier?
These are the census tracts, so the bigger than the geocodes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep.
That's a very good question, Mr. Chernow. So Ms. Hogan, how will do we need to, is your office able to provide the answer, a definitive answer to that question, or is that something that we need to connect with the BPDA on?
I think this is when I'll connect back with the BPDA, who provided some of the first answers in this presentation, and see if they have, if someone is able to come, or if they can provide me with some more detail that I can share with you.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, great question, Mr. Chernow. I do not see any other hands raised, so I think we can go to the next couple of slides, and then I'll go to Dr. Tung.
So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but you will see these when the presentation gets sent out that you can look at. So we did include maps for each of the variables, so you can see the distribution across the city for each variable within the tier. And there's a slide for each map, so they are a little bigger too. I did want to go back as one last note. I mentioned that after their initial implementation, Chicago added a school performance variable. And so this is an example I took off of a website that's linked at the bottom. But they added into their tier calculation a weighted average of schools' state standardized test composite scores. So in their example, there's 300 students and they all went to one of two schools. 100 of the students went to a school with a composite score of 75. 200 went to a school with a composite score of 60. So the weighted average of those two would be 65. And so that 65 is then incorporated as another variable into the tier calculation. This is again, something that I think we would want to consider. Is this something that we would want to replicate in Boston? What might that look like? But wanted to share that as an additional piece of their tier calculation that I did not incorporate into the maps that you just saw. So with that, those are my final slides.
Thank you. Ms. Hogan, no, could we put that slide back up, please?
Sorry, yep.
Ms. Hogan, on this particular slide, what is CPS, Chicago Public Schools, trying to achieve with this performance variable?
That's a good question that I don't have enough context on to answer what the addition was intended to do. But I think we can try and get some more information from colleagues in Chicago to see if we can answer that. But it wasn't part of their initial tiers when they first rolled out this process.
Right. Thank you. Given that it wasn't part of their initial policy or their initial implementation, it would be helpful to understand what problem or issue they were trying to address by adding this particular factor. So we can better understand how it might correlate or not to the Boston landscape.
Yep.
Dr. Tung, I know you had your hand raised and held your question.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to one of the analyses that Monica, you were going to run later, where you were going to analyze the opportunity index of feeder schools. And I asked for you to add the number of seats that each feeder school got in 2 previous years. Would it be possible for you to also add the meets rate of MCAS? So the proficiency rate for the school as a whole, and also by race, ethnicity, by SES, by ELL stat, and by students with special needs. Does that make sense? So just more columns.
Yep. Yeah, the most recent MCAS data we have available is 2019. So the years might not quite line up.
Yeah, wherever you have data would be great. Thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions? Okay, I do have one. I wanted to just going back to the requests from the task force for data related to specifically disaggregated data related to the invitations to the schools for this year. It's disaggregated in historical data. I know last week you indicated that you thought Friday you'd be able to have that for us. Is that still in your plan?
Yeah, I know Ms. Roberts wasn't able to join us tonight, but it's our intention to share some additional data on Friday in response to the requests from last week.
So thank you. For me, that data is a priority. So that, and especially again, looking at both the current data, but also, and the historical data, as the cuts were requested, or the disaggregation was requested. So if you think that it's not going to be possible, could you please flag that for us before Friday?
Yep.
Thank you. Any other questions? Dr. Tom.
If you're about to move on to public comment, can I just make a request for a future point of discussion?
So actually, we are going to move on to task force discussion. So do you have is this a data request or, okay. So now it's fine, it's fine if you want to share it now.
Well, I asked the question at a meeting last week, just to have a conversation among task force members about what we each mean by rigor, and if we have a task force consensus definition of rigor to move forward with, since that's one of the charges of our group. In the charge, it reads, maintain rigor while increasing representativeness.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Chernow, do you have a question for Ms. Hogan, or is it a general?
It's a general. It'll be real
Okay.
quick.
No, so let me do this. So Ms. Hogan, thank you very much for your presentation and for sharing the information with us. We look forward to having the opportunity to review it and may have additional questions at an upcoming meeting. Thank you. Mr. Chernow.
Thank you. I guess this is just a general statement for both members of the task force and people who present. I was just wondering if we could use more accessible terms. I know we all get caught up with using acronyms and stuff, but as someone who hasn't spent much time and is late, was joining this committee late, it's hard for me to stay connected when we're using a lot of OBI. Like, there's a lot of acronyms. So I just asked if we could explain even like some of the more complicated vocab words, just try and break them down for both me and I'm assuming the audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the note and for the reminder. Absolutely. And to that point, from a facilitation standpoint, I will try to be mindful of that as well and try to clarify or ask speakers to explain certain terms or acronyms. But certainly if there are questions, please, and this is for all of us, you know, please don't hesitate to ask for clarification. We can definitely do that. Ms. Tung, want to go back to your question about rigor. You did put that on the table for us. Do you want, are you comfortable if we kind of indicate now for the group that that we'll discuss that on Friday, so folks can really kind of take the next couple of days to think about what rigor means for each of us? Great. I think you've rightly pointed out that that is part of our charge to kind of balance these two things. So, well, at least these two things. So appreciate that. Ms. Lum.
I just have a more nuanced point to make to Ms. Tung's question, I think, around rigor, which is whether we feel the standard of rigor is something that is fixed or if it's something that is relative. And the reason I ask that is because MAP growth as a test is relative. And not only is it relative within the individual student's performance, but as a national meta level component, it is relative to the country's performance as well. I think he said there were 25 or 29 million students who take that test. And so the scores of performance, both achievement and by virtue of achievement, the growth that happens slides according to the national performance standard of students. So if national performance, for better or worse, likely worse, is degrading, what does that mean to the standard of rigor at exam schools?
Great. Thank you. Is everyone comfortable on the task force with us taking this, being prepared to have this discussion on Friday? Does that give folks time, the time they need to kind of reflect on the question, also taking into consideration Ms. Lum's point here?
I don't think we can afford to delay it any further than that, Ms. Sullivan. Yeah, it's got to be Friday.
Great. And hope, and Friday, I believe, you know, the other point is I want to make sure that our school leaders are able to participate in that conversation. Otherwise, I'd say, why don't we start today? But, but want them to be able to fully participate. Great. So we'll take that up on Friday. With that being said, we should transition into our discussion. We did receive some additional data today. We started the conversation last Friday with respect to, you know, for each of us, some of the things that we would like to see. Again, you know, with an understanding that we don't yet have the full picture of the current interim policy and its full impact. Does anyone have additional thinking from yesterday? Yesterday, it feels like yesterday, from Friday?
I just wanted to thank Ms. Parvex, Ms. Sullivan as well for getting the Boston Parent Coalition Circuit Court decision to everyone, in addition to the other materials to us over the weekend. It really, I don't know how deeply we'll get to the nuances of threading the civil rights jurisprudence needle. Well, we're already we're already in that conversation, really, because whatever methodology we adopt has to survive constitutional testing, inevitably, constitutional muster. It really is a thorough decision for a circuit court decision. Most of it is dicta, which means nothing to anybody else but us. You know, it's an advisory opinion, like 80% of it addressed to us. I've just started scratching it. But at some point, I think we all need to, whether you have a legal background or not, be conversant in it. And I would love to read it through before. Frankly, I think it's so important that I don't know that I would feel comfortable, Ms. Sullivan, you know, rendering much of an opinion as to, you know, which direction to go in until first receiving this really excellent instruction, which I'll definitely do my homework before Friday.
So I appreciate that. I have read both the district court and the appellate opinions.
I know you have.
And would agree with you. I definitely think they are both just incredibly instructive, very interesting for this particular task in front of us and for other purposes, quite frankly. That said, I am mindful of what Mr. Chernow put on the table for us before we started this conversation. And so I do want to make sure that we figure out a way to ensure that we can all, you know, if we all take the opportunity to try to review both of those opinions, as Mr. Acevedo has suggested, rightly suggested, you know, as best we can. And then perhaps we can, I know Mr. Keating spent a little bit of time with us on Tuesday at a very high level, kind of reviewing those, but we can look to put time on the agenda for us to walk through kind of key points, takeaways, learnings, guidance, guardrails, all of those wonderful words that both opinions provide to us, so that we can make sure that as a task force, we all have at least a base level understanding from which to work. Would that be helpful? I'm seeing like the nod. Yes. Okay, perfect. So we'll work to do that. Excellent. Any other thoughts at this point? If not, I am going to turn it over to Ms. Parvex. Okay, great, Ms. Parvex.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. We have 7 speakers this evening, and each speaker will have 2 minutes per person. Please state your name, affiliation, what neighborhood you are from before you begin. When I call your name, please raise your hand virtually in Zoom. Also, please make sure you're signed into Zoom with the same name you used to sign up for public comment. That will allow us to identify you when it's your turn to testify. I will move you up as a panelist, and we will ask you to turn on your camera for public comment. First speaker is Cheryl Kelleher. Cheryl, if you're there, please raise your hand. Kelleher. I don't see her. Next person is Weimin Zhao. Weimin?
Hello,
Yes, hello?
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You can turn on your camera if you would like to.
Hi. Good evening. My name is Weimin Zhao. I'm a resident of West Roxbury. I was reading the exam school admission summary published on BPS website and found all charts in this summary provide a data comparison between this year and last year, except for one table called school year 21 to 22 invitations by zip code. So there was only this year's data in this table, and the last year's numbers were missing. And the summary says in some zip codes, there was a little to no change in the numbers of invitations received this year. However, zip codes with the lowest median family received more invitations than last year, including zip codes in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan. So I was curious how this conclusion was reached without last year's data. So I looked up on BPS website and found the last year's invitation numbers on another web page. So after a little analysis, I found two things in this summary didn't seem right. First, only one zip code, South Boston, 02127, had no change in numbers of invitations this year. And only one zip code, Head Park, 02136, can be considered a little change because the invitation decreased by less than 2%. And all other zip codes had a change from 23% to 430%. So I don't understand how that conclusion, little to no change in some zip code, was drawn from the data. So the other finding was that among the zip codes with the lowest median family income, 5 of them actually received the less invitations this year. So Longwood family 02115 down by 33%. So Roxbury down by 35%, Chinatown down by 71%, South End 02118 down by 25%, and the Dorchester 02122 down by 26%. So that conclusion that the zip code with the lowest median family income received more invitations than last year doesn't seem right too. So if what I found were wrong, please correct me because I do not want my comment to mislead the public. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, Mr. Zhao, thank you very much. Could you please email us your analysis? That would be very helpful. And we have asked for the district to provide the task force with the historical data. And so we were told today that they would be providing that to us on Friday. So hopefully we all will be able to take a closer look. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Jing Song Chow, followed by Veronica Brozek and Yufang Wrong. Jing Song Chow.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. I'm a resident of City Boston in the neighborhood of West Roxbury. And by the way, as a layman in the field of education, without closely following the past meetings, my comments remain to be very general. So, everything considered, I saw a need of change for the historic admission policy. However, I strongly opposed the change being made for this year's application process. I think they were too drastic and unpredictable. Such application process will hurt the 3 examining schools very hardly and irreversibly. So we need to maintain the objective, but not rather than subjective criteria for to evaluate students across different schools. When the equality is considered, I think we need to focus on the equality in the face of opportunity rather than outcome. So otherwise, we will run into a risk of sacrifice academic excellence and competitiveness. And eventually this would undermine the prosperity of the city of Boston and our nation. And so education brings in hopes to each family, and is essential for people's life and the family prosperity. People will make decisions based on the best interest of their family, and then if their policy change is too drastic, and then people will move around and move out. So therefore, all admission policy change should be thoroughly considered and balanced between the maintaining the curriculum rigor and the other social factors. So that's all I would like to say. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Next speaker is Veronica Brozek, followed by Yufeng Brown. Veronica. Veronica.
Am I off mute now? I'm sorry.
Yes, you can talk. You can talk now.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of everything that's gone into this meeting. I've listened so closely, and I'm off note now because I had a lot of things I wanted to say before. As a parent of a student who has gone to BPS and now doesn't, she's going to go into 9th grade. I'm following this process very closely because for a lot of reasons. I really want to just say my most important focus, I really hope this team keeps in mind, is rigor. I really feel that the delay in choosing how the schools that children are going to be assigned is very stressful to not the families, but the children in general. Especially there's so few seats for 9th grade that I feel that we really need to keep in mind that we have 5 months to go before the test gets taken, and that we don't rush to a decision, but please keep in mind that there's a lot of people who it's really important to. So I'm sorry, I had a lot of great notes, but I understand what goes into this process now more. So I just want you to please keep in mind the children and that it's fair. And by the way, my daughter now does go to a private school and they do not grade. It seems like there's some prejudice or like a bias or something about like how they grade. They do not grade, they do not give A's. So thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Yufeng Brown. Yufeng, you can unmute and start your video. Yufeng? You're muted. You're muted.
Okay, finally, I'm
Perfect,
able
thank you.
to find the button. Hi, my name is Yufang Rong. I'm a Boston Latin school parent. I'm from West Roxbury. So first, thank you for all your work again. So I have a pretty long testimony, so let me read it. So on the surface, the one-year interim plan helped achieve your diversity goal. However, if taking a deep look at the data, I'm afraid that the plan fails miserably. First, the BPS stated that invitation numbers remain the same in some zip codes. As the first speaker said, this is not true. In a time of a pandemic, the least that people want is instability and uncertainty. Second, also pointed out by the first speaker, many zip codes with low median family income did receive less seats than last year. Here, I want to highlight Chinatown. Last year, Chinatown had 24 students admitted to the 3 exam schools. This year, only 7 seats. Many of Chinatown families can neither afford private schools nor move because their jobs are in Chinatown. So you shatter their children's American dreams. Third, in this interim plan where a student lives and if a teacher is strict or not when grading students are the most important factors. Low-income families living in high-income zip codes were harmed. AWC kids were harmed. Working hard was not valued. This policy and the process of producing this policy did not reflect any of the American values. There's no fairness, justice, equality, or equity. So this one-year policy has caused irreparable damage to many young lives and their families. So for the new plan, first, I urge you to understand the impact as much as possible before implementing it. Second, please do have BPS share the impact analysis and the data for doing the analysis to the public for comments before you make any recommendations. Third, drastic changes will mostly lead to disaster. I urge you to make gradual changes. Fourth, please give families at least 1 year in advance when you make changes to the policy. In fact, according to the 2021 ranking of the school diversity by niche.com, Boston Latin Academy and Oak Grant School ranked number 4 and 5 in 400 public high schools in Massachusetts. Boston Latin schools also got an A. Please don't replace something that works, although not very perfect, with garbage. Again, thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Minnie Bareng.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much, everyone, and good evening. My name is Minnie Bareng, and I live in West Roxbury 02132. I have 2 boys. One is Matthew, who's lucky enough to get in BLS last year and loved every inch of it. Unfortunately, my Marcus. Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Sorry about that. All right, so Matthew was lucky enough to get in BLS last year and love every inch of it. Unfortunately, my Marcus 6th grader in Joyce Gilmer has not been invited to BLS or any of the exam schools despite his A+ grades. I actually tested him too with ISE just to gauge his qualification. He scored confidently enough, high enough for the traditional BLS admission test. I'd also like to mention that I am a Filipino and I advocate for diversity and equal opportunity. But in our effort to bridge the gap in BPS education and to provide equal opportunity to every kid, I think that the 2080 represents a reverse discrimination amongst deserving students. There got to be a higher percentage for merit-based seats. I feel like the several GPA data points are not reliable as they vary in class, teachers, and other factors like private and public schools. But so therefore, there has to be a standard or concrete criteria on a test to fairly choose deserving students. The 2080 doesn't seem to be fair. Marcus didn't choose to be in 02132, you know, and he didn't choose to have, you know, a parent who earns above average. I mean, at first, you know, he thought that having a good job can be now a liability. But, you know, I thank you for this opportunity. It is my aim that for every child to believe that they are given equal opportunity based on their own performance and not on their parents' choice of zip code, and not on their parents' ability to provide for them, and not based on their color. Believe it or not, I have experienced racism before too. I've stood head high, but this one really hurts me a lot. That I think every kid, especially Asian American kids are not given equal opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Olga Yuzakov. Olga, if you're there, please raise your hand. I don't see her. So Ms. Sullivan and Mr. Contopasis, that concludes our speaker for public comment.
Thank you. Mr. Contopasis.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Is there any further business to come before the group today? I don't see any. I will therefore entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting. May I have a motion?
I so move.
I move.
A second, please.
I second.
Thank you. Ms. Parvek, please call the roll.
Thank you. Mr. Acevedo?
Aye.
Ms. Aguirre?
Yes.
Mr. Chernow?
Yes.
Mr. Kreger?
Yes.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom? I'm not sure if she... Ms. Lam?
Yes.
Ms. Nagasawa?
Yes.
Dr. Tang?
Yes.
Ms. Wade?
Yes.
Ms. Sullivan?
Yes.
And Mr. Contopasis?
Yes.
Thank you.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all. And we look forward to Friday.